But rather than introduce everybody together at the beginning, I thought I would introduce them as they're about to speak. And our first speaker, who's going to have a bit of a video clip for us, is Hamlin Grange. I've known Hamlin for a long time. He's been involved for 20 or more years in issues of racial diversity. He was a member of the Toronto Police Service Board, and he served on several working groups, committees, and reporting groups for various government agencies with respect to cultural and racial diversity. Hamlin Grange.
Thank you, Howard. Good afternoon. How are you doing? Oh, good. I want to get your energy level now, okay? Because I know it's been a long day for you. Let me do my magic with the my technology. I have a way of breaking things, so bear with me, folks. Good. This is good. It's a good sign. Great. Let me start by saying thanks for inviting me to be here, Howard. The work that you do, I think, is obviously important, and will continue to be important in terms of social justice, and especially as it relates to police interaction with you and with me, the public. So I want to start off by setting the stage a bit, context. On September 4th, rather, 2014, LeVar Jones was going home from work. Lives in South Carolina. He got into his pickup truck, and he was eventually stopped by a South Carolina state trooper when he got out to go to a convenience store. Here's what happened next. Nothing happened. As you watch this, I want you to listen. Listen to the conversation, and listen to the words that are being said by both parties. This is obviously dash cam video from the trooper's perspective. Now the audio will pick up again in a few seconds. me end it there. Mr. Jones survived. He was shot several times. The trooper was charged. He pleaded guilty in court. But the question, the fundamental question I think you need to ask here, oh, and another thing has happened as a result of this. LeVar Jones has been paid a settlement of $285,000. As far as I know, the officer has not yet been sentenced. This is back in 2014, this incident took place. So the sentencing has not occurred since that point. So for me, the fundamental question is, let me just get out of this and go back to my PowerPoint. I'll close this. The question here is, was this implicit bias or was it explicit bias on the part of the police officer? He claims during his court appearance that he was suffering from the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder from an earlier on-duty shooting incident where he was not injured. This happened 2 years earlier, in 2014. Or was this exactly a case of explicit bias against a black unarmed man? That's the fundamental question. But then you also ask your question, so what is implicit bias? It's the process of associating stereotypes or attitudes towards categories of individuals or people without our conscious awareness. It is unconscious assumption about a group of people, for example, people from race, based on gender, religious affiliation, etc. And it affects our behavior in ways we might not want. There's been a lot of research, a lot of conversation about implicit bias. The reality of implicit bias, I don't think anyone argues with the reality of unconscious bias and implicit bias, that we all can be victims of that in terms of association. But fundamentally, I believe it's what we do with that information. And when you're in a position of authority, with the authority to use deadly force, that realization and that second thought becomes even that much more important. Then the question is, what leads to implicit bias? It may be formed as a result of exposure to stereotypes, whether those stereotypes are good or those stereotypes are bad. And I just list some of those comments that you may be familiar with. Women are more nurturing than men. Women are bad at driving. Black people commit more crimes, and it goes on and on and on. We're bombarded with this information. We get it from the media, we get it from our co-workers, we get it in print, we get it in social media. We're bombarded with sort of information in our heads. But explicit bias is something else. It's this negative attitude or belief that we consciously hold, and we endorse those about a particular group of people. And it can be expressed in derogatory statements about groups of people, including, for example, the use of racial slurs. That's explicit bias. It's not just unconscious. We make a decision that we're going to act in a particular way towards a particular group of individuals. And implicit bias has been linked to black people in crime. Police officers and undergraduates and some studies were quicker to identify crime-related objects coming into visual focus when they were first exposed to black, but not white faces. And this is specific to the implicit association test that you all can take online by the Harvard University. And there's one particular test that I think could be quite interesting. There's actually a test connecting race and weapons and harmless objects. I don't know if you've actually been online to do this test. What it does, it shows images of black or African American individuals, men and women, and whites, both men and women, with weapons and objects, whether it's guns like this, swords, cameras, cell phones, whatever, and you quickly go through and make those associations. What's interesting is the response that we get from individuals doing the test. I did the test a few years ago, and what was interesting was my own response to it. It actually turns out I have a slight association with associating black people with weapons. Now, you'd say, wow, I mean, you're a black man. You do this for a living. You work in this field. how could you be associating black people as being dangerous? Well, why not? I'm no more susceptible to the information that's coming from media and social media and listening to other people than the other person. I am just as susceptible to that. I may know what to do about it. I may be less susceptible, but nonetheless, I am susceptible. We're all susceptible to this stuff. We need to think about that. What I found also interesting, what came out of this, Keith Payne, he said, in a snap judgment condition, race shaped people's mistakes. They falsely claimed to see a gun more often when the face was black than when it was white. And that means white people does it, white people do it, and people of color do it. Maybe to a lesser degree than whites, but it happens. It talks about what do we do, what we need to do in our society to break that cycle. It's that whole notion of the dangerous black body. Black people are seen to be more dangerous. Time and time again, we hear police officers responding to a particular situation, and a young black man, let's say the age of 12, was somehow to perceived to be much older than that individual is. We see the individual as much dangerous because of color. This is research that's been done, it's ongoing. But I think we also have to be very careful about this. We can simply say that, well, you know, my brain made me do it. And I think that's an easy way to go about it. We must be very careful. The reality of unconscious implicit bias cannot be used, it should not be used as an excuse for our actions. We heard this from the FBI director, Cooley, at the height of all the shootings. And he started talking about unconscious bias, and suddenly the media jumped on all. Oh, well, you know, those officers during the shooting at Ferguson and all the other places, there's unconscious bias. They didn't mean to do it, their unconscious bias kicked in. Again, their brain made them do it. I think this is a very dangerous argument, it's a dangerous defense, and it should not be acceptable, and it should not be ignored when you hear these kinds of things. In the Denver study, a study that was done some years ago, they put individuals, ordinary community members, through the test. Some of you may have heard of this. It was a simulated test, almost in a laboratory environment. And they had ordinary folks in the community shooting at suspects, supposedly suspects, some of them black, some of them white, some of them armed, some of them not armed. And what was interesting, community participants were faster to shoot if the target was black rather than white. Police and community members were just as fast to shoot an unarmed black target. And both groups were affected by racial bias. Interestingly, police make fewer mistakes. I'm not surprised at that. They're trained not to make those kind of mistakes. Ordinary folks aren't trained to those kind of things. But there are still some issues, I think, regarding the Denver study. There are a number of things that are missing out of the equation of the Denver study. As I said, the Denver study, which also was done in Chicago, it was in an artificial environment that did not take into account a whole host of things. Things like culture, socioeconomic status, all of those things. So I think there's work to be done. And even the researchers that did the work recognized the fact that there was work to be done. Yet, police services and police leaders continued to point to the Denver study, the shoot, don't shoot study, as proof that police officers are are better in terms of responding to these shoot, no shoot kind of scenarios, and that they're no better or worse than the public. I think it's a specious argument, and I think it should be stopped. I really think we need to question that. There's a lot of talk and a lot of work around anti-bias training. The Toronto Police Service is doing it. A lot of other services are doing it across North America, even in the UK and elsewhere. But I think we have to be very careful about anti-bias shootings and anti-bias training, because the shootings continue. The shootings continue, and other negative outcomes as a result of that between police and the public. Implicit bias training, I believe, it seems to focus on raising awareness of unconscious bias or implicit bias, but it often do so without those biases alongside explicit biases, systemic or institutional biases, and other issues that are likely to swamp any effects of implicit bias awareness training. In other words, if we're not confronting the ways of police culture or the criminal justice system or media representations are biased against certain groups, awareness of implicit bias will do little to prevent racial bias in policing or society more broadly. So everyone is saying the jury is still out on this. Yet a lot of are being taught anti-bias, or what they call fair and impartial policing. No one's really tested to see whether or not this is actually working. Is it actually sticking? But they're not doing it. I think what's missing there is another piece to this. And I like to talk about intercultural competence in terms of how officers are interacting with the public. How are our officers navigating or bridging differences with the community that they're engaging with? Officers need to know how they're navigating cultural differences, how they're bridging and how to change cultural perspectives and behaviors when they're encountering differences. That is not being done in a fundamental way that I think is required. It's enough to say to officers, yes, you have implicit bias, but what are we doing to help these officers? What are we doing to help ourselves to better understand how we're actually navigating and experiencing those differences? Very quickly, there's a continuum that we talk about, and this is a tool that I use with clients. In fact, we completed a major research project with the Toronto Police Service some years ago. That report has still not been made public. And we looked at how are officers and civilians navigating cultural differences. Along the continuum, we can see that there are various stages or orientations that individuals can fall under. There's a denial orientation where the individual simply misses differences. They don't see culture. They don't think culture has anything to do with how somebody's interacting with them. The other orientation is that they're judging differences, meaning that they're polarizing. They're polarizing oftentimes in a negative way, them versus us. The other orientation is a minimization orientation, where they minimize differences. They look for commonalities. They look for common grounds. They look for the things that say we are the same, but they're not dealing with the differences in front of them, whatever those differences are. The next orientation along the continuum is acceptance, where an individual actually recognizes and sees that there are differences that need to be bridged and understood in order to better interact with each other. The final orientation is adaptation, where the individual actually not only sees and recognizes differences, but they have the tools and strategies in how to bridge those differences. What we're finding is most police officers, most cops on the front line operate within a monocultural mindset, meaning that they're either in a minimization orientation or in a polarization mindset. They're minimizing or they're actually judging oftentimes in a negative way. There is much work to be done. At the end of the day, I think we need to ask ourselves, are we giving the kind of support to our officers that's required to be better servants than they are today? And my submission is that we're not. I think we're leaning on this thing called implicit bias, and we're just letting it slide. I think we need to ask some fundamental questions. I'm hoping that this panel will address some of those questions, and I'm just seeding some conversation for you to think about. Okay?
Asmi, who is the Director of Policy, Education, Monitoring, and Outreach Branch at the Human Rights Commission of Ontario. And Dr. Asmi has been involved in these issues, particularly as they relate to policing and working with police services to try and improve police services adaptation to the multicultural society that we live in. And he's spoken a number of times on this issue, Dr. Asmi.
Hello, everyone. So I think I'll jump in. I have no PowerPoint, so I'm just going to talk. I'm going to sort of jump in sort of from another angle on this whole issue of implicit bias. And generally from the framework that we at the Human Rights Commission are starting to understand issues of racial profiling in policing, but also across the board. We just released for those who don't know, a report on racial profiling called Under Suspicion. I have a few copies there, which whoever wants can grab them at the end. And we've described racial profiling as something that occurs not just in policing, but in retail, in child welfare service activity, education, healthcare, in a number of environments. And we're talking about something that also is related to other kinds of discrimination or profiling in other contexts, outside from just race, aside from just policing. So whatever I'm sort of speaking to here is reflects our understanding and thinking of how organizations, institutions operate to end up being discriminatory against particularly groups that have stereotypes associated with them in society. And in policing, of course, we're very attuned to that because it tends to have very destructive outcomes. Policing as a pursuit may lead to somebody being dead, somebody being killed and shot. In other contexts, it may not be as harsh. People will experience in school streaming. That comes out from racial profiling. But the impact of it is not as immediately as visceral as negative. So we don't focus as much attention on it. So I'm going to focus on policing, but with that idea that what we're talking about really covers a lot of different areas of experience of discrimination and bias in society. And that the solutions are similarly to be found across these other sectors. So first I'll start off by saying that implicit bias, unconscious bias, is the fashion of the day. You do have in the United States and coming into Canada the idea that this is something that is central to the experience of racial discrimination, racial bias in policing. And so you have training that's been undertaken on this in the US, now brought into Canada. Toronto Police Service spent a lot of resources on undertaking this kind of training. And it undoubtedly has an element of validity to it. Nobody would question that people have unconscious bias based on the social science that exists out there. And nobody would question that people acting on that can make decisions that are biased and discriminatory. So we fully accept that idea. But that is sort of not seeing the full range of sources for what amounts to bias and discrimination in organizations and including policing. So in general, I like to sort of typify the reality of bias ranging from individual-centered bias that is explicit, implicit and unconscious, and something we haven't talked about here and what police are, and not only police, but many organizations are very reluctant to talk about, and that is systemic bias and systemic discrimination. This is sort of a spectrum of sources of bias and discrimination in institutions. Explicit bias, Hamlin sort of spoke about. Those are things that people know and are conscious of. And one should never discount how real that is in the experience of bias and discrimination in policing and other institutions. It's there. Any of the studies that you'll see on attitudes towards groups in Canadian society, in American society, has always demonstrated that there's a significant segment of the population that has very explicit, overt, conscious biases, and they want them, and they like them, and they want to manifest them. And that segment intersects into many of the dominant group institutions, like policing, like education, like healthcare, and they're there. So there's a source of bias that is explicit and conscious in the minds of people who are perpetrating them, and in institutions and organizations where they make up a big chunk of the population, it can be quite an overt phenomenon. Definitely if you go back in Ontario, to policing in Ontario, you'll have seen very explicit conscious bias manifested in police services at all kinds of levels. In Ontario, going back a decade or two, that would have been quite normal. Police services used to have racial slurs being used very commonly amongst officers. And we just saw an example of this recently. There was a decision on the Sandu case in Brampton, where Sandu was an officer in the Peel Region Police Service. When he started off his policing career and he was introduced, he was, the racial slur, Paki, was used to describe him when he came in. That was very normal, that was very conscious, that was explicit. They didn't think there was anything wrong with it. They just thought that's the way organization, society should behave, people should behave. So there is a significant chunk of very explicit bias that is part of what the bias people experience in policing is there. Nobody should discount that. That's there, and it's there today still. The segment that relates to unconscious bias is probably a bigger segment now. Explicit bias is more and more unfashionable and more under threat, although there's now a backlash. We've just seen in the United States the election of a very explicit, biased racist, and a whole segment of the population that doesn't think that's so bad, right? Many of them may have voted for President Trump, not with the idea that they want to be associated with his racism, but they didn't think it was such a bad issue or a big deal. We in Canada probably have a similar kind of segment of the population that's like that. So in Ontario, there is a significant segment of the population that manifests unconscious biases, doesn't think too much about them, doesn't really want to challenge them, but they don't want to uphold them strongly such they're explicit. And that's a part of the bias that comes from policing. And there needs to be, there is efforts to try to address that. And I'm going to sort of talk about the range of responses once you understand this sort of wider model of the sources of bias in policing and other institutions. The next segment I'd focus on is systemic bias. And systemic bias is bias that has become ingrained within the system of institutions and organizations like policing. And we in the Commission divide this into two basic realms: culture and policies, practices, decision-making processes, and structures. So culture and these policies, practices. Now the policies and practices are like the skeleton of an institution. They're what gives the framework and the structure of the institution or the body of the institution. And the culture is what gives it flesh around it. These together make up systems that operate in an institution. So culture and policies, practices, and procedures. It's important also, while we're talking about this, not to separate between these too strongly. Today's culture is tomorrow's structures. So our structures of policing are remnants of the cultures of previous days. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, remnants of that. And generally speaking, structures like that take a longer time to adapt and change than cultures, but cultures themselves are hard to challenge. So if you're looking at the full source of bias, you're talking about explicit bias, individual-centered, unconscious bias, individually centered, and systemic bias, culture, policies, practices, and procedures that are structured into institutions. Policing has, like any institution, has bias, discrimination that can be connected to these different pieces. And to address them all, one needs to address them all, actually. The tendency is to focus on one. Historically, the way people saw discrimination, racism in policing is explicit bias. That's how it was always conceived of, and most people still think of bias and discrimination in policing as the explicit type. That's how people respond. They say, we got to get rid of these people who are these racists, and police love that. Police institutions love that because that fits in with their theory of the source of discrimination in policing. It's bad apples. A few bad apples who don't reflect the whole, and if you get rid of those bad apples, we'll all be okay. We've moved on a bit from there, and people have said, okay, unconscious bias. Yep, we need to address that, and now we're starting to see efforts of training to address that. But that is only going so far. And I think Hamlin pointed out some of the risks, some of the issues with that kind of perspective. It doesn't cover enough of the terrain of what is the source of bias and discrimination. It's individually centered. You're looking at the individuals, their actions and their behaviors, and it's very difficult to change them. It's very difficult to train somebody for a day or two and say, okay, you got unconscious bias, here's a 2-day training, and now you can deal with that. It just doesn't happen that way. There's many more elements involved to deal with unconscious bias than just training, but again, police institutions have generally loved that, because that's easy. They can say, as Hamlin said, oh, it's not our fault, and we're training to deal with it, and once the training is done, we'll be okay. And as I think we've all seen, and will continue to see over the next few years, that is not going to get at it. That's not going to deal with the full range of issues. Where the real issues are, dealing with bias, is in the systemic components. Culture, policies, practices, and procedures. That's where the core of bias is to be found, which has the most pernicious impacts, the most sustained impacts, the most difficult to address. And that's where the focus has not gotten into in policing. We've raised it at the Commission, but we have a lot of reluctance on the part of police institutions to actually accept that. And I don't think we have. I think yet we've gotten the acceptance of that in policing. So part of that is culture, part of that is policies, practices, and procedures. Let me just sort of describe a bit of how that operates on these two sides. In terms of culture, you have an institution across Canada that is essentially a reflection of the dominant groups of society. Fundamentally, in terms of race, that's the white dominant group. And it's largely male. If you're primarily talking about the type of culture that we have in policing, it's white male culture. And it is a culture that marginalizes, by its nature, a number of groups: women, racialized people, people from lower classes. It marginalizes a number of groups because of that type of culture. And it operates to prevent people from succeeding in policing who are from these marginalized backgrounds. You go across Canada and you'll find very few police services that have representations of women and racialized people that is more than 20%, 10%, even less in most institutions. Toronto Police happens to be a leader in numbers in this regard, but it's still a minority, a significant minority. So they haven't gotten far in dealing with those issues in policing. The culture is corrosive to these other groups, and these other groups don't fit in. When they come in, there is great pressure for them not to stay. And this is still an issue going on to this day in policing, and it's not going to be easily addressed. Now, the systemic side, in terms of policies, practices, and procedures, there's where you'll see the formalization of an understanding of policing and an understanding of what is good policing as opposed to what is bad policing. That really builds into it bias. And I'll give you a quick example of that. Police patrol practices, police definition of crime, and police understanding of what policing work is. Policing in general, in this country, it has a law enforcement model that it operates by. Basically, its vision of itself is, we're there to enforce the law. And there are criminals, or potential criminals, who have to be dealt with in enforcing the law. So the vision of the people they are serving they're not serving, they're policing. They're commanding, they're forcing. Despite all the language of community policing, that's still the model of policing in our time. And what that does is it has an unrealistic vision of what policing actually is. If you go out to the streets and see what police actually do ride-alongs with police and go to different parts of this province and go to police in different areas, mainly what they're doing is they're putting out brush fires. They're dealing with people with mental health conditions, homeless people. They're not dealing with crime. They're not fighting crime. They're basically trying to manage people who happen to be difficult from the perspective of the dominant society. And that's the majority of their work. That is pushing to the criminalization of people who fall into these other categories of people. So who are the people being charged? Who are the people who are going to jail? They're largely people who with mental health conditions, people from racialized groups, people who are in poverty. That's who is being criminalized and being sent to jails, because you have a model of policing that doesn't actually deal with the realities of what policing work is in our times. So that's systemic bias. That's seeing the world from a visor that is disconnected from the reality of what's actually needed in society. And we need a vision of policing that structures into it a completely different vision of what policing is. If you do that, that'll change a lot. That would change a significant portion of what police officers do. Who's being hired? Are you hiring maybe more social workers, more mental health workers than actual frontline officers? Well, are you going to be bringing people who are civilians to do that job rather than sworn officers? You need to really think out a vision of policing that conforms with reality, not with what the model of policing has been historically. So systemic elements are very big in terms of how they operate and how they marginalize and how they manifest bias and discrimination. So a complete vision would look at all of these things: explicit bias, implicit bias, systemic bias, culture and policies, practices, and procedures. And you've got to do the full gamut of these issues to try to address bias that is manifest in policing every day. And that's the big challenge before us, and I just wanted to, in this context, to contextualize implicit bias, where it really lies in this whole matrix. It's a small piece of the whole puzzle. And that's unfortunately the piece that we're focusing too great attention on, and not enough on the systemic elements that really need to be the source of real work. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Dr. Alok Mukherjee is a professor at the Ryerson University, has been involved in human rights and policing since as long as I've known him. He was the former chair of the Toronto Police Service Board in an era when they, although we certainly did not agree as often as we would have liked to, certainly far more effective than the present Police Service Board. Dr. Mukherjee.
Thank you very much, Howard, and good afternoon. I want to talk about a particular aspect of police culture in relation to the issue of bias, and I will draw on some research from the UK and the US for my remarks. There is a considerable amount of talk these days about police culture. In his report to the Toronto Police Service, former Supreme Court Justice Frank Iacobucci addressed the topic in his report on police interactions with people in mental health crisis. The Toronto Police Services Board's Transformational Task Force devoted an entire chapter of its final report on culture change within the organization, the topic that my friends here, Hamlin and Shaheen, were talking about. What struck me, however, was that both reports and most other commentaries and discussions on police culture deal only with the formal aspects of institutional culture, calling for action on the part of the management. The expectation appears to be that such management-driven change in institutional culture will result in change in behavior at the street level. I am interested in exploring what I would call informal culture. That is like the submerged part of an iceberg, and that shapes and influences the behavior and responses of the frontline cop. This informal culture works through history, folklore, mythology, symbolic action, and memorialization. Though I will talk about the frontline cop, keep in mind that in our model of policing, every police officer, no matter what the rank, starts and spends a large portion of his or her career as a frontline cop. So, these observations apply to all police officers. I believe that the common phrase, culture trumps policy and training, refers to this informal dimension of police culture. It encapsulates as well the admonition that coach officers or mentors of rookie officers are said to give to their trainee, the rookie. Quote, forget what you learned in the police college, learn from the street. Of course, the reference is not to your or my street, but the street as viewed through the lens of a frontline police officer. Informal culture helps police officers on one hand to make meaning of the world they are tasked to keep under control, and on the other, to interpret their role and the rules governing it. In a large measure, it shapes what Jerome Skolnick calls the police officer's working personality. His conclusions were drawn from research on policing in the UK. As Skolnick points out, two consequences of this personality are a sense of solidarity, that is, we are in it together, and social isolation, that is, it's us versus them and they don't understand what we do. On numerous occasions, I got to see the power of this informal culture in big and small ways, but perhaps none brought it home to me in the way that the imbroglio surrounding the so-called Facebook controversy did in December 2014. Let me briefly recount some parts of that controversy. On the morning of December 5th, 2014, the president of the Toronto Police Association began a campaign demanding my resignation as chair of the Police Services Board. The call was related to a meme from Occupy Wall Street that I shared on my Facebook page the night before about police killings of innocent people in the US, particularly African Americans. According to the association, by posting this meme, I had, and I quote, crossed the line and exhibited a lack of objectivity that made me unfit to sit on a police oversight body. The association's condemnation was picked up by a section of the Toronto police officers at all levels of the organization. To be fair, there were many who did not agree with the campaign and the criticism, but what interested me most were the messages I received from those who supported the call for my resignation. They provided a vivid glimpse into the workings and power of informal police culture. Let me give you a few examples from the pile of emails that I received. One email said, and I quote, "Get out of office and join the rabble you seem to identify with." While another advised me to, quote, "Do the right thing, pack your bags, we never wanted an immigrant in that seat to begin with." Yet another appeared to me to sum up what these writers were saying, and I quote again, "You're," his spelling, not mine, "a police hater," all in capital letters. Most messages suggested that I had revealed my true feelings about the Toronto police members and their families. This is a quote. Others objected that I had appeared to side with Occupy Wall Street. One asked, quote, "Why are you friends with Occupy Wall Street? These people are borderline terrorists who associate with known terrorists such as Black Bloc, etc." To me, these messages reveal what the so-called thin blue line means and does. It generates a herd mentality, a feeling of us versus them, and a deeply conservative political ideology that contributes to an inability to accept, let alone understand, criticism of police actions or misactions. One letter brought this realization home to me more than all the others. It came from someone who did know me well, someone with whom I had interacted many times over a period of years. From his retirement post in Bermuda, he wrote, "Good afternoon, Dr. Mukherjee. You might remember me as having been Chief Blair's driver and occasionally yours as well, from 2005 till my retirement in October 2012. I wish to take up as little of your time as possible, but I do want to let you know how greatly disappointed I am in the posting of the ISIS, Ebola, and American police poster on your Facebook page. I personally am offended by your post and see it as you showing your true colors and feelings towards police officers in North America. You cannot think that just because the poster mentions American police, that Canadian police officers would not feel part of that. After all, were there not demonstrations in Toronto re the Ferguson outcome of the grand jury decision? When a Toronto officer is killed, we have police officers from many jurisdictions in the US attend their funeral as we attend theirs. One would have hoped that since joining the TPSB, that is Toronto Police Services Board, in 2004, that you might have learned that we are all one family and that we all hurt when one of us gets killed, regardless of what department or country. I had hoped that as chair of the TPSB, you would have asked for cooler heads to prevail and point to the facts that in each case, the judicial system with grand jury investigations and hearings were followed, and that we are a country of law, and had the victims not drawn attention to themselves by allegedly breaking the law and resisting arrest or assaulting an officer, that none of this would have happened. So it was their fault that they were killed. No, instead you post "I can't breathe" on your Facebook. This is not acceptable, and I do think that it is time for you to go. These are excerpts from his letter. This was the most complete rendering of the mindset and the culture that many police officers had internalized and shared uncritically. His notion of police officers as one family was revealing. There must be no challenge, criticism, or disagreement. And it extended beyond colleagues within one police agency or even one country. I was supposedly guilty of disloyalty, of acting like a police hater for a post that was about policing in the US. The letter brought into sharp focus the huge disconnect between police officers like him and those segments of the community who were vocally critical of police use of lethal force. To my police correspondents, these were radical, even terrorist elements. I was not the only one in a public position to face this wrath. At the same time that McCormick, president of the Toronto Police Association, was on the warpath against me, his counterparts in New York had started a similar campaign against the new mayor of the city, Bill de Blasio. De Blasio's crime had been that he had reacted strongly and emotionally to Eric Garner's death, speaking as the father of a mixed-race son, and he had put a stop to the odious practice of stop and frisk. Since he was an elected public official, the New York Police Union could not demand his ouster, but it showed its disapproval in other equally intimidating ways. But then even President Obama had not escaped the opprobrium of the US police unions for saying that if he had a son, as a father, he would have been afraid for his son's safety. It was as if there was one war manual that police unions across the US and Canada worked from. They were indeed a family. So it was not a coincidence to me when, in very similar language and at the same time, following the killing of a New York police officer, the president of New York Police Union and the president of Toronto Police Association were to allege that people like de Blasio and I were responsible for such deaths. The comments by McCormick and others bring out the elements that define the police officer's working personality, as Skolnick calls it. Two of these elements Skolnick identifies are danger and authority. The belief that a police officer's job is dangerous, and every time an officer answers a call, there is a potential for danger, plays a big role in shaping this personality, including behavior, social relationships, outside policing circles, and in-group cohesion. Official symbols, the ever-present Kevlar vest, the belt full of use of force options, the in-car camera, for example, as much as the unofficial rituals, such as the massive funerals and other forms of memorialization, reinforce the sense of danger. The sense of potential danger results finally in a personality marked by suspicion. Officers become especially attentive to signs of danger, such as violence and unlawful behavior. Danger is the other element that shapes this personality, namely authority. That is, the power to enforce laws and rules. To be sure, this is a police officer's statutory responsibility, who is given the discretion to carry out according to the officer's judgment and assessment. It is the subjective impact of the element of authority in shaping personality that we need to consider, especially when combined with danger. Earlier, talking about the reaction to my Facebook, I mentioned the deep conservatism that those reactions revealed in terms of their characterization of activist groups like Occupy Wall Street. Skolnick's research supports this aspect of the police officer's personality. He theorizes that police officers tend to be emotionally and politically conservative. According to him, and I quote, if the element of danger in the policeman's working role tends to make the policeman suspicious and therefore emotionally attached to the status quo, a similar consequence may be attributed to the element of authority. The fact that a man is engaged in enforcing a set of rules implies that he also becomes implicated in affirming them. The police response to issues like ending the practice of carding and legalization of marijuana are cases in point. We see it in the way in it the way in which the two elements of danger and authority influence response. They produce, reproduce, and reinforce suspiciousness as a behavioral characteristic. And that suspiciousness leads to the classification and labeling of people. From an extended field study of a large urban police force in the US, John Van Manen concluded that police officers categorize people in three groups: quote, suspicious persons, quote, know-nothings, and quote, the assholes. This classification is clearly not based on any objective evidence, but derived from sources like folklore, anecdotes, subjective experiences, and so on. Nor are the categories always mutually exclusive. The same individual can be a suspicious person at one point and an asshole at another, while the know-nothing could slide into the suspicious person category. All the same, it is useful to distinguish the three categories. As a veteran street cop said to Van Manen, and I quote, "I guess what our job really boils down to is not letting the assholes take over the city. Now I'm not talking about your regular crooks. They're bound to wind up in the joint anyway. What I'm talking about are those shitheads out to prove they can push everybody around. Those are the assholes we gotta deal with and take care of on patrol. They are the ones that make it tough on the decent people out there. You take the majority of what we do, and it's nothing more than asshole control." End of quote. So, in this formulation, the regular crook is the suspicious person who is a suspect because of some illegal or criminal action. And the know-nothing is often the innocent who is maybe someone who calls for service. It is the group stigmatized as assholes that we need to think about carefully, especially in a discussion of implicit bias. Who then are the assholes? Here is Van Manen's description. The asshole: creep, big mouth, bastard, animal, mope, rough, jerk off, clown, scumbag, wise guy, phony, idiot, shithead, bum, fool, or any of a number of anatomical, oral, or incestuous terms, a part of every policeman's world. Unquote. Assholes, that is, are suspect not because of what they do, but who they are, and how they look, dress, talk, walk, etc. They may become suspicious persons, but that is not what brings them to the police officer's attention in the first place. They are stigmatized and, quote, treated harshly on the basis of their failure to meet police expectations arising from the interaction situation itself, according to Van Manen. Keeping them under control in the name of protecting society is an important practical and moral justification for the police officer's existence. And that task of controlling the assholes is fraught with potentially serious consequences because of the process involved. The process involves 3 stages. Affront, which involves some challenge to an officer's authority, whether real or perceived. Clarification, whereby the officer determines the meaning of the affront. And remedy, that is the course of action that follows clarification. The objection of the critics of my Facebook was that I had associated myself with an asshole group. You can see where I'm going with this. As I said before, it is my view that implicit bias is endemic to the informal culture that shapes and affects police officers' working personality. This is not unconscious bias insofar as the classification of people is not an unconscious act. It is very much a conscious process, though based on factors that are not objective or supported by evidence. They are subjectively derived based on, although officers may claim that their suspicion and labeling are based on years and generations of street experience. The very fact that society is seen as consisting of decent people and those who should be controlled has a built-in bias, especially when one considers the groups that get stigmatized and often penalized for who they are and how they look, act, or dress, or where they live. It concerns me, as I'm sure it concerns you, because the consequences of this informal culture with its built-in bias run counter to all the formal practices. It is deeply entrenched, and as we think about some of the disastrous and deadly police public encounters in our own city, we have to ask how or to what extent subjective interpretations of danger, authority, and people or groups played any role in the outcome. We have to ask as well how laws, rules, policies, training, and education, etc., can help get at this invisible phenomenon, the part of the iceberg that lies underwater, the bigger part. I do not believe that noble sentiments about police culture, as contained in the Toronto Police Service's Statement of Commitment on Mental Health, or textbook prescriptions from business manuals in the report of the board's transformational task force would do the job. The same goes for the formal investigations and reviews that deal only with the visible part of the iceberg. Thank you.
Either lawyers or about to become lawyers, and are the co-founders of an organization that I guess is, I'm not sure if it's just in Ottawa or whether it's spread to other areas, but they are the co-creators of an organization referred to as Between the Lines, whose mission, among other things, is to take laws, make them understandable to members of the community and average people so that they know what the law is either prohibiting them from doing or encouraging them to do. So I'll leave it to Samantha and Maori to decide how you want to split this up, but
this is Samantha Peters, and we're both here on behalf of Between the Lines, and it's a public legal education project. The three, and actually there's another member, Naomi Sayers. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it here today. The three of us met in law school at the University of Ottawa. Samantha and I graduated last year. We're currently articling. Naomi is graduating this year. I see some other U Ottawa folks in the audience. So yeah, we're feeling good. We were asked to speak about, in terms of implicit bias, what can community organizers, social justice advocates, lawyers do to minimize the negative impact of implicit bias on police-community relations? So that's what we'll be speaking about today. We have three main points that we want to cover, and Samantha will start off with the first one.
Okay, so I just first wanted to thank the panelists for laying the groundwork on how we're going to talk about community responses. So first we're going to begin by demystifying the law. Okay, so implicit bias is built into colonial law, and as a result, the law is not neutral. It's created in a way that allows implicit bias to exist safely and to escape scrutiny. And so the dangers of implicit bias is that it impacts the most criminalized and the most marginalized people. So examples of that would be the overpopulation of Black folks and also Indigenous people, in particular Indigenous women, in the prison industrial complex, right? And that's via anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. Other examples of implicit bias is the over-policing of racialized and criminalized communities. And as a result, the impact of implicit bias is our deaths. Want to go ahead? Okay.
So when we're talking about how to minimize the negative impact of implicit bias on our communities, and what we mean by demystifying the law, like that's how, when we thought of Between the Lines, the three of us, this being a community-centered public legal education initiative created by like three racialized feminist women, what BTL seeks to do really is to ensure that laws and legislation affecting criminalized communities are easy to access, understand, and anchored in lived experience. And so our vision, as BTL, I refer to as short, is to see access to justice initiatives directly supporting and benefiting criminalized communities. So to that end, what BTL is doing, cornerstone of our work, is engaging in a critical line-by-line analysis of legislation that has a disproportionately negative impact on racialized and criminalized communities. So we launched last year, July 1st, 2016, which was the date that the updated Ontario police carding regulations were released. Many of you may know that. And so what's up on the website here is just like a sample of what's on our website. What we actually did is we went through the entire regulations and tried to put it into plain language. Brown communities that are attending the parade, and we know there's like a hyper police presence that's there. So it's really important for these communities to know what their rights are when it comes to the practice of carding. And I'm sure folks in the room are familiar with street checks, police checks, when people are stopped, ask for their information. They may not have done anything. Police are just, protecting the community. And then this information is entered into a database. We don't know what's happening with the data. That's a whole other issue on its own that's really, really problematic. And so what we wanted to do in the article was highlight some of these issues, talk about bystander intervention was another thing. People are not feeling safe to talk to police and exercise their rights. We can talk to the community about what their rights are, but really, at the end of the day, those who are heavily policed are not ready to stand up. They're in fear of their safety. Right? So they're not really ready to stand up and say, well, actually, you're supposed to give me a document, and you're supposed to do this and that. Like, it's definitely more complicated than that. So those are some of the things we wanted to touch on. BTL also presented at Ontario's first week-long Access to Justice conference, and this was hosted by Law Connect Ontario and the Action Group on Access to Justice. And we've had many consultations over the last year over various things like the Changing Workplace Review and the Independent Police Oversight Review. And so BTL regularly tries to contribute to these consultations as well. And so what we're trying to do in terms of demystifying the law is like unpacking it, putting it into plain language, and making it accessible to the communities that are most impacted by it.
Okay. So we're also a community resource. So what that means is that the information that's provided on our website can be used to do community work in whatever way that you want, but also a way that is safe, right? And that's just only to underscore the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all way to do community work, and we need to recognize that some people may not literally be on the streets because of their history of police violence or anything like that, right? And also want to be clear too that our work we're not trying to duplicate the work of other activist groups or community organizations, but simply contribute or find ways to build capacity and be able to work together, right? Because we just started this in July 1st. There are people that have been doing this kind of work for years. We're not trying to speak for or on behalf of anyone. And then further to that, so Mary was talking about the fact that we are breaking down legislation and putting it to plain language rather. So what we're doing specifically is taking otherwise inaccessible information that requires specific and often expensive legal training, which already makes law out of reach for people, and then putting it into everyday language in order to speak to what the law says, how the law is used, how the law is often abused, and also how it's wielded by institutions like the police. And so just to underscore that this kind of work needs to continue to happen, because literally we're talking about people's lives that are at stake every day.
We really appreciate one of the points that was raised earlier by one of the panelists about systemic bias. And really that's what this is about, right? Like law, structural racism, systemic racism being built into the law really allows for implicit bias to exist and thrive. So I don't think we don't really need to say this in this space, because like we're progressive people at the Law Union Conference, and that's great. We really need to spread that message that law's reputation as like a neutral and fair system needs to be really challenged. So in terms of a community response, and what we as lawyers and social activists can do is really making implicit bias explicit, right? So calling it out. Because implicit bias appears really as everyday common sense, as matter-of-fact business. So we need to be pointing it out so that people can't hide behind the veneer of like, this is the way things are, or I didn't know better, or I didn't realize. And so how can we call this out? Between the Lines did this with the carding regulations. And an example of this is when you really look at it, like for example, a big reason for why the carding regulations community has been like rallying against, and I know people at the Law Union, our friend Peter Rosenthal, I don't know if he's here right now, but we always get the emails from him to attend the deputations about this stuff, right? The community has been rallying against this, saying like, we need an end to carding. This needs to stop because it perpetuates racial profiling, it's harmful to our communities, it encourages police harassment and police violence. And it's not a good thing. In fact, most recently, the Toronto Police Services commissioned a report titled Understanding the Impact of Police Stops. And the report itself that they commissioned, interesting read if you'd like to take a look, says that carding is not effective, right? And it was interesting to hear them talk about this at the meeting, because then the board just went on to say, well, the carding regulations are great because there's procedural fairness. Now you get a document, there's a way to track this, it's in a system. For old data, there's like protection levels in terms of how you access the data, all kinds of justifications. But again, like in terms of making implicit bias explicit, if you look at these regulations, a really clear one, if you look at section 5.1, it's not up there, but a big problem was like, okay, the carding regulations perpetuate racial profiling, or they can be the impetus for it, right? People are being racially profiled. The idea now with the updated regulations is someone can't be approached solely based on their race. However, there's so many exceptions if you look at it. Someone can in fact be approached for their race as long as it's paired with one other piece of information about them. And that could be as broad as what they're wearing, the neighborhood they're in, their behavior. And so when you put it like that, I mean, you can see how implicit bias will ultimately function, and people will continue to be racially profiled. Of how these regulations are really hard to understand, ambiguous, and still continue the problem of arbitrary collection of information. At the Access to Justice Conference, we actually did a little experiment. And it'd be cool if we could have done it here as well. The idea was to, we paired up with a professor from the University of Windsor, Professor Noel Semple, and he uses something called usability theory. And the idea is to look at how accessible are statutes for the public, for the mainstream public to understand and use. And so we presented on the work that we've done at BTL, and there were two groups. One was using like BTL's information through like a decision tree, and then the others were given like a printed copy of the regulations. And then we acted out a scenario. And in that scenario, it was a situation of someone being stopped, and we asked the audience, can you tell us if there was a violation of the carding regulations? Interestingly enough, clearly people that were going through just reading the regulations, they were lost. They were like, how are we like going to determine? It's ambiguous. People had different interpretations of like whether or not the person was approached for their race or something else. And so it was just like interesting to see that in practice. And so this is just one way where we're trying to call it out, right? Like we're putting it in plain language, But if you look through the website, we're also asking some critical questions along the way. Like, what does this really mean for the communities? Like, are we really being protected by the police, or in fact the same community still being targeted?
Okay. So, So Hamlin said everyone is susceptible to implicit bias, right? So often when we talk about implicit bias, we're always talking about policing, but we're going to shift the conversation to talk about implicit bias in the legal profession as well. Even Dr. Azmi was saying anti-bias training does not change someone over 2 days, right? And so just as a side note, we also think that this kind of training or intersectionality of curriculum, for instance, should be starting as early as law school. I don't think that we should be waiting until you're called to the bar and then you're doing CPD programs. It should be starting in law school, right? So when we talk about, property law, we should be talking about, we should always be thinking about it in an intersectional way. Criminal law, public law, all of those kinds of courses. So all that to say is that the responsibility of lawyers, so lawyers should, especially those that are committed to social justice, should be really putting pressure on the Law Society and other organizations that put on CPD programs to ensure that these CPD programs are put on through an intersectional analysis, right? And further to that, are put on by lawyers or people who actually practice in an intersectional way, but also by racialized folks, right? Like, we need to value the voices of racialized people in the profession, Black lawyers, Tamil lawyers. We should be given these opportunities to speak on these subjects, right? So it's great that you may have a PhD in criminology, but I'm pretty sure that a Black person that lives through anti-Blackness every day and that is working in the profession could speak about this phenomenon in a way that I think is necessary and unique to a Black voice. Further to that, I think that pressure needs to also be put on the National Judicial Institute. So when courses are created for judges, those courses really need to be in an intersectional analysis, because now, at the end of the day, it's those judges that are making these decisions. So if judges are not understanding systemic white supremacy, if they're not understanding anti-Black racism, if they're not understanding the transition from slavery that was abolished in 1833, and then 1835 the first prison was created, and the same people that were slaves were then thrown into prisons, and then how laws and policies are created are disproportionately impacting those same people, right? So I think that judges need to be able to understand that and need to understand that full stop, but also there needs to be education for lawyers to understand that too, particularly when they're working with racialized clients or they're working in those areas of laws such as criminal law or human rights. Also, we need to talk about lawyers' responsibility. So there's a professional responsibility for lawyers to do those courses, but there's also rules that govern, for instance, mandatory withdrawal. So I think that lawyers need to take that rule seriously. If you do not understand anti-Blackness in a really critical way, and you're representing a Black client, and it's in criminal law, for instance, not that that's not the only area of law, but if you're representing a client in that area of law and you don't understand that, then you do have a professional obligation to withdraw from that case, right? And there's also rules that govern competency, right? So if a lawyer is incompetent and doesn't understand these things in really real ways, then yes, you're gonna have to withdraw because you're incompetent and you don't understand that, right? So it's not just a professional responsibility to the Law Society and to yourself, but it's a professional responsibility and just responsibility full stop to your client and to the communities that you are representing or maybe fighting for.
And the final point in terms of making implicit bias explicit is for us as community organizers and social justice advocates to take up space. So I think people at folks at the law union are going to be familiar with this sort of tactic, a political tactic of physically taking up space. But as progressives, we also have a tendency to sometimes surrender those spaces to those in power because we feel like these spaces may be with the elite are futile. It's a futile exercise to go in there. But really, like, it's really important that we continue to take up those spaces, like, so attending things like the Toronto Police Services Board meeting, the protests, the sit-ins, the whatnot, and really providing a voice and democratizing those spaces and providing for, like, a plurality of voices to really call out, like, what is happening.
Okay, thank you. Our third and final point is with respect to implicit bias and supporting community members who are at the brunt of it. And really, the important thing right here is to defer to lived experience. And for us, that's a part of decolonizing the practice, is to value community voices and lived experience, right? It's to abandon the idea that there is one single expert and that lawyers are that sole expert and have exclusive right over how laws are interpreted and how laws are being challenged. Further to that, a part of that is decentering whiteness, right? So there's also responsibility of white folks and white passing folks to permit space for racialized people to speak for ourselves, but also when you're getting those opportunities, for instance, and it's about carding, and you're a white person that frequently, I guess, writes about it or knows a lot, there are a lot of black folks that are they're not getting the opportunities to talk about these things that have a lot to say, right? So there's also responsibility on social justice lawyers that are white, as I said, and white passing to, you know, give up some of that space and give up those opportunities and give it to racialized lawyers to speak on those issues.
PTL is trying to really center lived experience. One example of this is reaching out to the community members to elicit their experiences. So what we did is we've done a call out to community members to maybe write a blog post about their experiences with the police. And we got a few entries. We were able to provide a small honorarium to one of our writers. His name was Mark. And he wrote about his interaction with, a couple of interactions with police that were negative. I'm just going to, unfortunately negative. And I'm just going to read an excerpt just to kind of bring, power to his statement, his blog post rather. And so, I'm just going to give a little bit of a backdrop. He's explaining in the blog post, and it's available on our website, 2 separate incidents where he was stopped by police. The second incident was he was with his friends and he was just going to pick up lunch. And the police pulled over, started questioning them, and he describes it as they jumped out of their vehicle, demanded we put our hands on their car, we were being searched, questioned, spoken to, as though we were guilty simply because we were black men. In the end, a teacher from their high school actually saw this happening and intervened, and ultimately, that's how the interaction was broken up and everything ended up being okay. But really, it wasn't okay because this is how he felt walking away from it. And I'll read from what he wrote. He wrote, quote, "I still feel violated and powerless. I felt embarrassed because I could not advocate for my own freedom. Ashamed because I was asked about the personal details of my life to prove that I was innocent. Humiliated because people passed us and had already convicted us in the court of public opinion." I think it's a really powerful sentence that he wrote right there as well when we talk about community, implicit bias existing in community members on an individual level as well. So not only when racialized folks are being policed, and specifically black folks are being policed, and having those interactions, they're not only facing that impact from the police, but also the people that are witnessing this experience, because they know they're being judged to some extent, right? And there's already connections being made without even knowing what the situation is. He goes on to say, "We were not criminals, just a couple of young black men walking to pick up lunch." And so it's really important for us as an organization, not only to be putting law into plain language, as best we can, and asking these critical questions, but a big part of what we want to do going forward, again, we're a young organization, is to really try to provide a platform and then amplify the voices of community members who are experiencing this. So the next phase in terms of that for us is we are, thanks to some support from the Law Foundation of Ontario, BTL received a small grant, And we're going to be looking at another piece of legislation and unpacking it similarly to the way that we did with the carding regulations. But in order to do that, what we're going to do is conduct a community needs assessment. If there are any law students or like folks that know law students who would be interested in coming on board to assist us with this project, we are able, with our funding, able to provide an honorarium for their work. We are looking for 1 to 3 volunteers to assist with this needs assessment. It's actually going to happen quite soon. There will be a call out, so you can follow us on Twitter and our social media for more information. And so we'll be doing a needs assessment, consulting with community members, organizations that are supporting community members that are affected in these ways. Again, we're referring specifically to racialized and marginalized folks. And then we're going to be determining like what's the next area of legislation or law that community members are telling us they feel they want some more information on and they would feel better supported in that way. And sorry, one more thing to mention is we're actually, a big chunk of our funding we're going to be using for a law student fellowship. So please also stay tuned and spread the word about that. So once we complete the needs assessment, we determine the next area of legislation that we'll be unpacking. We will be hiring a law student fellow to conduct that analysis, and it'll, it's over 3 months, $5,000 for the fellowship. I think that's a good amount. Hopefully we're doing the best we can also to support the labor of marginalized folks who often do this work for free. We're doing this actually on a volunteer basis. So please also spread the word about that. So this is, again, another way where we're trying to like go directly to the community, directly to the people most affected, and defer to lived experience as expertise. And then moving along, what we can do is make sure as lawyers that we continue to be connected to social movements, because the work of law is really important and it's just one tool, right, in the fight for social justice, but it by itself, and I'm sure we all know this, it can't achieve much. So what I've heard recently, actually in conversation with folks in other spaces, there seems to be, for some people, sort of a false binary where like lawyers exist on the one end and then community organizers exist on the other. But really, and what we've done in spaces like the Law Union is rethink the profession. And so we're just reiterating the point that, in order to be a community lawyer, we need to take our lead from the community. So we're supporting people and identifying what their own needs are and motivating them to act on their own behalf. And
just to add to what Mayuri was saying is that we need to recognize that learning is not a vertical process, it's horizontal, right? We can learn both ways, and I think that that's important when we're doing this kind of community work, but also it's really important to move away from that savior kind of lawyer work that happens a lot. And I think a part of moving away from savior legal practice is to recognize that learning goes both ways, and there's a lot of horizontal learning that is possible in this kind of work.
Leave you with that we don't really know the answer to is like, how do we shift responsibility on to the people in positions of power? Because one thing that's real, as we were thinking and preparing for this presentation, is like, yeah, we need to take up the spaces, we need to do this, we need to like have another project and whatnot, but we're also really tired, and like there's so many other responsibilities and there's so many other like layers to our identity because of just who we are that make it really difficult and challenging to like continue to do this work, right? And often the burden of like calling out these systems is placed on the shoulders of those who are most impacted by it. So like there is that's just a question that we had, something maybe we can all think about some more, like how do we bring in and partner folks, because we're not saying like you go speak for us, but we're saying like let's work together more collaboratively. And those are our 3 points for today.
Yeah, so we just have like a final kind of point about doing this kind of work, because it's just a lot of information, we're saying a lot of things that can be a little bit overwhelming. But what we wanted to cement here is that if you're a social justice lawyer or you want to do this kind of work, then you have to remain committed. And it's also like full stop, like that's it. You got to remain committed. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be messy. You're going to go home upset sometimes, but it's not about going home and feeling warm and fuzzy. If you're feeling warm and fuzzy, perhaps you're not really doing the work, right? So I wanted to end with a quote by one of our favorite Black feminists, Audre Lorde. And the quote is, "Your silence will not protect you." So I think that's a little important thing to remember when you're doing this kind of work. Thanks.
20 to 6, but we could take 5 to 10 minutes for questions if there are any. I know everybody's had a long day, and before anybody leaves though, I have to remind you that the conference after party is tonight starting at 8 o'clock to 2 a.m. in the morning. Boy, it's the Abbey Bar and Grill, 989 College Street. So it's west of Young's. We had the party there last year, and it was a lot of fun. Very much to all of you for coming, and everybody, and certainly enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.